We will be going through the book which is titled Al-Usool min Ilm al-Usool. Al-Usool min Ilm al-Usool by Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And we'll get to the book shortly. However, I thought it would be more appropriate if that before we actually read the book and before we actually study the book, which by the way, we don't have too long. The time that we have 2 days is quite short for the book. So the explanation won't be in too detail, but we will try to finish it inshallah. But with that being said, I think it's very important that before we start, we go through an introduction regarding what is Usool al-Fiqh and mention some main important points regarding Usool al-Fiqh so that before we even start the book, you have a good understanding of what the book is about. So on the worksheets, I don't think you have the prints here. At the moment, you can just follow on the PDF. You don't have to write much right now, but inshallah, once they come, you can write on it. You can see it says, "What will you learn?" So you are the different topics that we will take in this introduction. And this introduction, if you can finish by Maghrib, that would be amazing. If not, then latest by Isha, inshallah. The plan is by Isha, bismillah. And then after Isha, we can start the book. What will you learn? So firstly, you will go through 10 introductory points when studying a science. The definition of Usool al-Fiqh, what does Usool al-Fiqh mean? What's it referring to? Its subject, meaning what is the subject matter? Its benefits and fruits, what's the benefits of studying it? Its lineage, we'll explain what these words mean. Its virtues, its founder, its names, its derivation. Islamic ruling of studying Usool al-Fiqh. Now, what's the ruling of studying Usool al-Fiqh? Is it something that you have to study? Or is it something good to study? And so on. Issues within Usool al-Fiqh. What are the issues that we take in the science of Usool al-Fiqh? Different schools of thought in Usool al-Fiqh, the different madhahib in Usool al-Fiqh. So just like in fiqh we have different madhahib, likewise in Usool al-Fiqh we have different madhahib also. Suggested books to study Usool al-Fiqh. So I'm just going to mention to you maybe a couple of books that are a bit more well known, that if you want to study, you know names of some books. And right at the end, names of books categorized by fiqh madhahib. And right at the end, just going to finish by just mentioning a number of books in the different madhahib, just so that you're familiar with the names of these books. I think the worksheets are out. I'll give 1 minute so that everyone can gain a worksheet, inshallah. More coming? Okay. Yes. And send some to the other side as well. Okay? Yeah. Okay. It says part 1. I'll explain why in a second. But in the first thing we're going to go through is these lines of poetry, which is a poetry including the 10 introductory points when studying a science. Before studying a science, normally there's an introduction, right? And in the introduction, a number of points are mentioned. A number of things are mentioned. The definition is mentioned. The different books are mentioned, and different mazahib are mentioned, and also, many different points are mentioned. So what's happened is that one of the ulama, his name is As-Sabban, who passed away 1206, which is also the same date somebody else passed away. Anyone know? Anyone know who passed away 1206 Hijri? No. 1206. 1206. Huh? I'll give you a clue. We studied one of his books. Muhammad Abdul Wahab. Rahimahullah. He was born 1115 and he passed away 1206. And he was 91 years old. So that's a easy way to maybe you can remember this. Anyways, Sabban, he made some lines of poetry, which if everybody could memorize these lines of poetry, it would be very good. It would be very good if you can memorize it, okay? I'll read it in Arabic, then read it in English, then I might repeat the Arabic a few other times, just so you can memorize, inshallah. Okay, that's right. The poetry it's not in the correct order. This happens when you write it on Word. Sometimes the ordering messes up. Anyways, I'll say it slowly what it's meant to be. It's meant to be إن مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة. Try to follow the Arabic. You can see the Arabic's a little bit, the ordering slightly changed. So إن مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة. The next line. You could maybe number it. I don't know what's happened to this. Maybe when I converted it to PDF, it was changed or something. I don't know. It's meant to be the second line. وَنِسْبَةٌ وَفَضْلُهُ وَالْوَاضِعُ وَالِاسْمُ الْإِسْتِمْدَادُ حُكْمُ الشَّارِعِ. It's kind of gone backwards. Yeah. And then the last one is مسائل وَالْبَعْضُ بِالْبَعْضِ اكْتَفَى وَمَنْ دَرَى الْجَمِيعَ حَازَ الشَّرَفَ. That's the actual way the Arabic's meant to be. I'll repeat it again in case you want to rewrite it or number it or however. إن مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة ونسبة وفضله والواضع والاسم الاستمداد حكم الشارع والاسم الاستمداد حكم الشارع مسائل and the rest is fine مسائل والبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع حاز الشرف. Okay, so maybe it might be best if you rewrite it properly. I don't know what's happened. One more time I'll say it. إن مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة ونسبة وفضله والواضع والاسم الاستمداد حكم الشارع مسائل والبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع حاز الشرف. So the English, in simple terms, just read the English inshallah. But if you can memorize the Arabic, it'll be very good. Because the Arabic, each line rhymes, so it's easy to remember. The principles of every science are 10. The boundary, I'm going to explain what each one means. The boundary, the subject, then the fruit. Its lineage is virtue and placer and name, derivation and Islamic ruling. If you know some matters, it is sufficient, and who knows all of them has the honor. Okay. Obviously in Arabic it makes a lot more sense than the English. Like I said, this line of poetry has mentioned 10 points, the points that are colored. These 10 points, they're known as 10 introductory points that you should know regarding each science before you study it. Okay? So whether it's Usool al-Fiqh, whether it's Aqidah, or even Hadith, you can apply this line of poetry to that science as an introduction. And what does these points mean? On the next page they're written. The meaning of each point. Boundary. What does it mean by boundary? It means definition. Okay, because when you give a definition of something, then you've basically give it a boundary, meaning anything outside of that definition is not part of that science, and everything within that definition, i.e. within that boundary, is part of the science. The next is the subject, i.e. the subject matter. What are the different topics which are studied in this? What are the different topics which are studied in this science? Number 3, the fruits, i.e. the benefits. So when you have a tree, what's the benefit of a tree? One of the benefits is that you get fruit from them. So that's why they use the word fruits. What are the benefits of studying Usool al-Fiqh? If anybody needs a worksheet, he's got some. Okay. The 4th is the lineage, meaning how is this science linked with the other Islamic sciences? Do they overlap, do they not, and so on. Number 5 is the virtues. Number 6, the placer, i.e. the founder. Who was the first person to write a book in this science? So that's when you talk a bit about the history of it. Number 6, the placer, i.e. the founder. So who was the first one to write a book in this science? And that's where you could talk a bit about the history of that science as well. Number 7 is name, i.e. what are the different names of this science? Okay, so for example, hadith can be called hadith, and sometimes maybe we want to refer it to as sunnah if you see them to be a synonym. So it's likewise here. Is it just Usool al-Fiqh or are there other names? It's not too difficult, it's just a couple of names. 8, the derivation, meaning where is the science derived from? So the science, where has it come from? From which other sciences have you derived it from? Yeah, number 8. So we're going to get to each point, we're going to speak about it in detail. The number 9 is the Islamic ruling. What is the Islamic ruling of studying the science? And then we have number 10, the different issues, i.e. matters within that science. So these are the 10 points which I mentioned, which we are going to take during this introduction. And we're going to add a couple of more. So these 10 are the 10 which I mentioned in the line of poetry. But at the end we're going to add also, we're going to talk a bit about the different madhahib in Usool al-Fiqh and also different books. So these are 2 main points that we will add at the end, inshallah. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. So this line of poetry, if you memorize it in the correct order, not in the order that's here, but if you memorize it in that order, then it mentions 10 points that a person should know regarding any science before studying that science. You don't have to follow this, but it's just one way to make it easier. So with that being said, we will start with the first point, which is the definition of Usool al-Fiqh. The definition of Usool al-Fiqh. The first question, why is a definition mentioned at the beginning? Whenever you study any Islamic science or Islamic concept, the first thing the ulama do is mention the meaning of it, the definition. So salah, what does salah mean? Wudu, what does wudu mean? Every single thing. Even sometimes something's clear, but the ulama still define it. So why do they mention the definition in the beginning? For 2 main reasons. The first is because you cannot understand something, or you can't delve into the details of something without understanding what it is in the first place. You can't delve into the details of something if you don't understand what it is in the first place. So for example, let's say you saw 2 people talking, and then you join, and how many times they're talking and you don't understand what's being said. So you ask them, what are you talking about? And they tell you, and then you're like, oh okay, now the conversation makes sense. Why? Because at first you didn't know what they were talking about. So likewise here, if somebody has no idea of Usool al-Fiqh and we start talking about the details of Usool al-Fiqh, they're not going to understand what's going on. That's why definitions in the beginning are very important. So even sometimes you may think something is clear, but the ulama still define it. Why? So that a person has a better picture of it. Because so that any misconceptions that they think is part of the science, that's taken out and so on. So that's the first benefit, is that you are not able to go into depth into a science except after understanding what it is. And secondly, once a person knows what he is studying, it makes it easier for him to attain his objective or achieve his objective. So once a person now knows Usool al-Fiqh, once he knows, then it's a lot easier for him to have an objective. Okay, this is Usool al-Fiqh, what do I want from Usool al-Fiqh? So if there's any details, any issues that are going, not part of his objective, then he knows that, okay, I don't need to spend too much time on this part, I can spend more time on this subject, because now he knows what Usool al-Fiqh is. The next issue is, as Usool al-Fiqh is 2 words, the scholars have 2 ways of defining it. So normally, when you define something, it's straightforward. Fiqh, you give one definition. Hadith, one definition. Sunnah, one definition. Aqidah, one definition. But the word Usool al-Fiqh is 2 words. Usool and Fiqh. So the ulama have 2 ways of defining it. The first way is by defining them as 2 separate words. So Usool, what does Usool mean? Explain what Usool means. And then Fiqh, what does Fiqh mean? And explain what Fiqh means. That's the first way of defining. The second way of defining is these 2 words as one word, as one terminology. Usool al-Fiqh, what is Usool al-Fiqh? So the first is by defining the word separately. What does Usool mean? And then Fiqh, what's Fiqh? And then the second way is Usool al-Fiqh as one word, what does that mean? As one title, as one terminology, what does Usool al-Fiqh mean? And we will take both ways, inshallah, especially because I want to talk about the word fiqh a little bit as well and give a definition of fiqh, so that way we can benefit both what is usul al-fiqh and also what is fiqh as well. So first, we are going to talk about usul as two separate words, and usul al-fiqh as two separate words. So the first word that we are going to focus on is the word usul. Is the word usul. Usul in Arabic language is basically referring to the foundation of something. It means it's the foundation, whether it's something tangible or intangible. So you could say the foundation of a building, something tangible, or intangible, the foundation of Iman, for example. So the foundation of anything, or sometimes they define it as something which other things are built upon, which is foundation. Things which other things are built upon. And that is what the word usul means linguistically. As for usul, now this word usul Islamically, meaning in the Islamic sciences and technically, the word usul has different meanings. Not usul al-fiqh, just the word usul by itself. Just the word usul, or the word asl, which is the singular form. It has different meanings depending on the context. And we're going to mention a number of those meanings. The first meaning is ad-dalil, a proof. So you'll find in the books when you read Arabic, if a scholar talks about a certain issue and he wants to mention the proof, he'll sometimes, instead of saying that what's the dalil, they'll say wa aslu hadhihi al-mas'ala, and he mentioned the ayah. The asl of this issue, i.e., and then he mentioned the ayah or the hadith. So that's what it means. Sometimes what asl can mean a proof, because the proof is the foundation of that issue. You have extracted the ruling from that proof. The second meaning is the stronger opinion. Stronger opinion. So for example, I'll give you an example in Usool al-Fiqh. They would say the asl in speech is the apparent meaning. Is the apparent meaning. Meaning, the ruling, when you see any ayah or any hadith, we take the apparent meaning unless there's a proof to show that the apparent meaning is not intended. Okay? So, because there are some people, that turn around and say that no, we have to interpret it. But we say no. The asl is that we take the apparent meaning, unless there's a proof to show us that we don't take the apparent meaning. So the word asl here is referring to the stronger. Meaning the asl is that we take the apparent meaning, i.e., this is the stronger opinion that we take the apparent meaning. Another meaning of the word asl is an ongoing principle. Ongoing principle. So, for example, a principle which is known is al-aslu fil ashya al-ibaha. The asl in the worldly matters is that they are permissible. That's a principle. The asl in the worldly matters is that they are permissible. So that's a principle in Usool al-Fiqh. We might take it probably tomorrow if we do. What's the ruling on me buying this particular book? The foundation, the asl is that it's permissible, unless you come to me and say that it's haram because it's got something in it or whatever. But the asl is that it's haram. Okay? So that now, what have I applied? I've applied a principle. So the word asl can mean that also. And we'll give two more meanings. And the next one is to do with Usool al-Fiqh. It's used in Usool al-Fiqh. And the fifth one is used in Hadith. So the fourth one, they call this al-muqis alayh. Al-muqis alayh. And this one's important because it's going to come later on. Al-muqis alayh, this is something used in the chapter of qiyas. So qiyas is basically analogy where you have like a new issue and you need to get the ruling of this issue, and there's no hadith that's talking about this particular thing. So what you do, you look at something that the Quran and Sunnah has already given a ruling on. So, like for example, they give the famous example of drugs, for example. Has the Quran particularly said that mention this name of this drug or something? It hasn't. So what the ulama would do is that they would look at alcohol. Okay, they would look at alcohol. And they say alcohol is haram. And the reason it is haram is because it intoxicates. Okay? And this reasoning can also be found in drugs. Therefore, it takes the same ruling. That process is called qiyas, and there's a whole chapter on it, which we will take. In here, the thing that you use, the thing which the Islamic ruling has already given, so in this case alcohol, that is called the asl. That is called the asl. Okay, we're going to need to know this because when it comes to the chapter of qiyas, we're going to mention qiyas as a number of pillars, and one of them is the asl. Okay, so it's good to mention it now, and then we will repeat it later on. So, the thing with the original ruling, not the ruling itself, haram, halal, but the thing that we are talking about, so in this case the alcohol, that is known as al-asl. And the last one is the fifth meaning is the Shaykh who is narrating the hadith. The Shaykh who is narrating hadith. So this is a meaning of asl in the science of hadith. So, let's say I narrate a hadith to Muhammad Ibrahim, for example. Who is the asl in this chain? Me, because I narrated the hadith. So this is another meaning of the word asl. Okay, so these are some of the meanings of the word usool. Okay, we finished with the word usool. Now we're going to move on to the next page, which is fiqh. Okay, and fiqh, because I see it to be a little bit more important than the word asl. I've added a lot of notes, so you don't have to write as much. Okay. So this is page number. Okay, I don't have the page number here, but where it says fiqh on the top, the next page. Right. Okay, so what does fiqh mean? Fiqh linguistically in the Arabic language, it basically means to understand. It basically means to understand. And I've given a number of examples for that. For example, the hadith of our Prophet says, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqqihhu fid din." We've highlighted the word yufaqqihhu. It's from the word fiqh. What does that mean? Whomever Allah intends goodness, He gives him the understanding of the religion. So, and then there's other examples which you can read in your own time, which are written here, but that shows that the word fiqh linguistically, it means to understand. Okay, what about technically? And this is very important. What is fiqh technically? This is a definition I believe Ibn Uthaymeen give. And by the way, this introduction, some of these points will come again in the book. Okay, but I found that the book's missing a lot of stuff. That's why I've made this worksheet for you. So if these definitions and stuff, they come again, then we can just read over them quickly, inshallah, when it comes to the book. But the fiqh technically means, and it's very important, this definition, knowledge of the practical Islamic rulings along with their specific evidences. Knowledge of the practical Islamic rulings along with their specific evidences. Okay, so firstly, knowledge. So it's a science that is studied, and then the word practical. This is the important word, practical. In Arabic, al-amaliyah. So it's to do with your amal. And the opposite of amaliyah is ilmiyah. Ilm, from the word ilm, knowledge based. So knowledge based Islamic rulings. And what's the difference is that the practical rulings are the physical actions that you do. How to pray salah, how to give zakah, how to fast, how to do hajj, what's halal in buying and selling, what's haram, rulings pertaining to nikah, and so on. And, we talked a bit about it yesterday, so the examples. All of these things are what? All of these things are practical, or physical actions that a person does. Whereas knowledge-based Islamic rulings, then that is referring to the science of Aqidah. So the opposite is ilmiya, which knowledge-based is referring to the science of Aqidah. So where is Allah? What are the pillars of Iman? What are the pillars of Islam? What is ihsan? What is shirk? All of these things is science of Aqidah. This is more knowledge-based. Obviously, there's an overlap in the sense that, for example, Iman is belief in the heart, and then eventually it manifests on the limbs. But what we mean is in the sense that you have your belief in your heart, but then when you do want to manifest it and you do want to do physical actions, how do you do it? And that's when fiqh comes involved. So you have the belief in Allah, you believe in Allah and you want the reward from Allah, and you fear His punishment, that's your aqidah. So you want to pray. How to pray? That's why you move on to the science of fiqh. Okay? And he says Islamic rulings, along with their specific evidence. Alright, civic evidence, this word is very important. Or evidences, should be plural. Civic evidences. Why is this word very important? Because this is the main difference between fiqh and usul al-fiqh. Okay, I'm not going to explain what the difference is now. When you get to the definition of usul al-fiqh, I'll mention it there. But what specific evidence basically means is that every single action has a particular proof for it. Okay? So, any issue, any fiqh issue, you'll have a dalil that this ayah, this hadith, okay? Why are the 5 daily prayers? We have the action of the Prophet ﷺ, where to put the hands, we have hadith, what to say in ruku', what to say in sujood. If somebody asks you, why do we say Subhana Rabbi al-A'la in sujood? We have a hadith. وَأَمَّا السُّجُود, the hadith Prophet ﷺ says, as for sujood, then you say this. So we have, every action, you have a specific dalil for it. That's what it means by specific evidence. Okay? And that, it might seem quite straightforward, but just keep that in mind, because when you talk about usul al-fiqh, this is where the main difference is, and students do get confused when you do talk about it, especially in the beginning. Okay? Fiqh is normally split into 4 parts. We mentioned this yesterday. I mentioned it as an extra benefit. It wasn't in the worksheet, so I've added it in the worksheet here. The first is your ibadah, or ibadat, which is your worships. So, tahara, salah, sawm, zakah, hajj. Then transactions, how to buy and sell, permissibility of riba, and what is considered riba, and all these type of issues. Family law, nikah, wali, what's a divorce, these are just examples. And then criminal law, such as punishments. In fiqh, actions, no matter how small, have specific evidence, i.e. every ruling has a specific proof for it. For example, when it comes to salah, there are specific evidences, each practical part of the salah, from where to place your hands, what to say, and the number of rak'at for each prayer. Okay. With this, alhamdulillah, we finished the first type of definition, which is defining the words separately. So now the word usul, or the singular asal, you understand what that is, and fiqh, you understand what fiqh is. Okay, these are the words separately. Now, the more important, because I'm saying more important because that's the topic that we are studying today, is what is usul al-fiqh as one word. Usul al-fiqh as one word, what is the meaning of that? Usul al-fiqh as one word is a knowledge where the general evidences of fiqh are determined and how they are to be benefited from, and the conditions of the beneficiary. I.e. beneficiary means the one who is benefiting. The one who is benefiting. In Arabic, al-mustafid, the one who is benefiting. Okay, so this definition is a bit long. Might not make the most sense when you read it the first time, so we'll break it down. This definition can be split into 3 parts. So this definition has 3 main parts. The first, what are the general comprehensive evidences? Because the beginning says, a knowledge where the general evidences of fiqh are determined. Right. In the definition of fiqh, what do we say? Specific. And what are we saying here? General. Very good. So now you can see this is one of the main differences. When we say specific evidence, we mean this ayah, this hadith for this certain action. When we say general, then we are not looking at particular ayat or particular hadith. We are looking at we are looking at the Quran and Sunnah and all of the other proofs from a bird's eye view. So we look at, for example, the Quran from a bird's eye view. We don't look at the ayat individually, we look at the Quran generally. So for example, you were studying Usool al-Fiqh, general more principles such as, are the different qira'at, can they be used as a dalil in fiqh? You look at qiyas. When can you use qiyas, when can't you use qiyas? Ijma'. What is ijma'? What are the conditions of ijma'? When can ijma' take place in our time now? So we're not looking at this ruling or the dalil is ijma'. No, that's fiqh. We're looking at the rulings of these principles and these evidences in the general manner. Okay? So, for example, let me just get this context page. So I can give you a number of other examples, okay? So in here, we have al-amr wal-nahi. So we look at commandments and prohibitions generally. So every time a commandment comes in the Quran, what does that mean? Okay? For aqimu salah, establish the prayer. Allah didn't particularly say the words, salah is obligatory. He just said, pray. Okay, you establish the prayer. So how did we learn, how do we come to the conclusion that salah is obligatory? Okay, so this is what I mean by general. Okay, but when we mean general evidences, then this is mainly referring to the Quran, the Sunnah, Qiyas, and Ijma'. Mainly these four. These four are the ones agreed upon. Then there are some which are differed upon, like the saying of a Sahabi. I'll mention it slowly. The first is Quran, the second is Sunnah, the third is Qiyas, and the fourth is Ijma'. These four are agreed upon. The Quran wa Sunnah, Qiyas and Ijma'. Or Ijma' and Qiyas. Ijma' and Qiyas now. Al-Quran wa Sunnah, Ijma' is stronger than Qiyas now. So these four are agreed upon. Then there are some which are differed upon. Saying of a Sahabi, Shar'u man qablana, which means the legislation of those before us. So for example, if Yusuf alayhi salam did something, is that a proof for us in Islam also? That's something we just studied. Or is it just there for us to benefit from in terms of just being a story? Okay, that's some general. Amalu ahli al-Madinah, for example. Actions of the people of Medina. We talked about Imam Malik. He used it more. Okay, but is that an actual dalil? Because they're just normal people, they're not prophets or anything. Is that a dalil or not? You know, and a few more. And istihsan is another one. Istihsan is basically, in simple terms, where a scholar, due to his vast knowledge, he comes to the conclusion, but he can't really explain exactly why that conclusion is. So is that, sometimes if you're in a certain field, and you become an expert in that field, you can tell if something's right or something's wrong. Yeah. So for example, in hadith, if a scholar, specializes in hadith, if he hears a new hadith, sometimes you can just tell that this is not authentic. Without studying the chain of narration, you can person didn't speak like that. So he just has that feeling. So that's basically istihsan. Okay, is that a proof or not? Okay, what are the rulings of it? So things like this. So this is what we mean by general evidences, and also general principles can also be used. General principles can also be used for that. Now, so an example of a principle which is really famous in Usool al-Fiqh is an unrestricted command. An unrestricted command. An unrestricted command necessitates obligation. Necessitates obligation. Okay, these are all examples so that you have a better idea. And inshallah we'll take these. We'll take many of these in the actual book, inshallah. What this basically means, unrestricted command. Command meaning what Allah commands you. Aqimu, establish, do this. Okay? Wa'atu zakah, and give your zakah. So these are commands. Unrestricted means, there's no other hadith which is contradicting or anything. If that is the case, then we look at it from a different way. Unrestricted means just that one ayah by itself is a command. Then it necessitates obligation, meaning that means that it's obligatory. So that's like a principle. Anytime you find a commandment to do something, and there's no other hadith or ayah or anything else which changes the ruling, then the foundation is that it's obligatory. That's a principle in Usool al-Fiqh. So that would answer the question I mentioned before. Allah says, Aqimu salah, establish the prayer. How do we get from the word establish the prayer to a salah is obligatory by using this principle. By using this principle. Okay, the second part of the hadith, second part of the definition, is and how do you benefit from the text, ayah or hadith? Okay, so this is the second part of the definition here at the top where it says, and how they are benefited from. Meaning, how do we, after we look at the principles and everything generally, when you have a certain word, how do we extract a ruling from that word? And this is where we study those sciences, those parts of usul al-fiqh, such as al-'am. Al-'am means general. So how do we know this ruling? Is it for a particular type of people, or is it for all of the Muslims? That would come under the chapter of al-'am, okay, which means something which is general. Then we have next chapter which is khas. This is specific, for a specific type of people, and so on. So this is also known as dalalat al-alfaz. Dalalat al-alfaz, meaning how do we benefit from the wording itself? How do we benefit from the wording itself? So the general evidences were, for example, is the qira'at, especially qira'at shadha, are they a dalil or not? That's general. But from this exact wording, how do we extract the wording? And then the third part of this definition, what is the situation of the individual who is benefiting? This is basically referring to the mujtahid or the scholar. Okay, the mujtahid or the scholar who is extracting the rulings himself. Who is extracting the rulings himself. So this is normally towards the end of the books of Usool al-Fiqh. They talk about who is an alim, who is a mujtahid, and who is a mustafti, meaning who is the one who is asking the questions, and then rulings pertaining to them. So even a person asking a question, how should he ask questions? A mufti, when should he answer a question? When should he not answer a question? All of these type of issues. And to help us further understand what is Usool al-Fiqh, okay, we finished with the definition. So hopefully it's kind of clear what are the things that we take in Usool al-Fiqh. But to help you understand a bit more is the next page, where we take the subject, i.e. what do the books of Usool al-Fiqh discuss? Okay, so this is very similar, very, very similar to the definition. Okay, very similar to the definition. This is split into 4 parts. The only difference is that there's one extra part. Okay, and this extra part, they've added it as part of Usool al-Fiqh because you need it to understand the rest of Usool al-Fiqh, and you need it to understand fiqh as well. So the first is the categories of rulings, i.e. fard, wajib, mustahab, makruh, haram. What's obligatory, what's recommended, what's disliked, what's impermissible. Okay, so this is the first type. So you'll study. For example, if you take wajib, we will discuss what's the meaning of wajib. Are there any other words that we could use instead of wajib? If something is wajib, then what is the effects of that, and so on. So we'll study, and same with mustahab, same with makruh and haram, and so on. That's number 2. And also, how do we know? How do you know if something's wajib? What different types of wajib? Anything to do with these rulings. And number 2 are the sources of evidences, meaning you mentioned Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, and these 4 are agreed upon, and the saying of a Sahabi, and all of them that we mentioned, they are differed upon, but they are also studied. They may not necessarily always be studied in the smaller books. So for example, Usul is considered a small book in Usul al-Fiqh. So maybe I don't think saying of Sahabi is studied in here. Maybe a few of the topics are not mentioned. That's because it's a basic book. In the bigger books, they are mentioned. Number 3, how to understand the evidence. This is dalalat al-alfaz that we talked about. That how do we extract the rulings from the wording itself? How do we benefit? Because usul fiqh is very precise. Whenever you want to give a fiqhi ruling of something, you have the dalil, okay, and you have something called wajhu dalala as well. Wajhu dalala. So if I said to you, the ruling is that this is haram, and the dalil is this, right? Ayah or a hadith. That's not enough. That's not for Maybe it's enough for general people, and that's it. But if for a proper student of knowledge or a scholar, that's not enough. There's a third step as well, which is you have to clarify that how exactly does the ayah apply to the ruling that you've given. Okay, so you have to prove that. Okay, how does the ayah show that the ruling is general? Why is it not specific? You can't just mention the ayah and leave it. Or how, if it's a commandment, Allah's commanding you to do something, maybe He's just advising you to do something. Meaning, why did He say it's obligatory? Why didn't you say it's mustahab? It's recommended. Okay, because sometimes people tell you to do something, and if you don't do it, it's not a big deal. They're okay with it. Okay, so it's something recommended to do. It may be an advice instead of a commandment, right? So you have to explain wajhud dalala, because if you don't, then that's when a lot of mistakes are used, and sometimes ayat which aren't talking about the topic that you're talking about, people end up using it for that. And that's how, we're going to talk about the benefits of usul al-fiqh. That one of the benefits of usul al-fiqh is that it preserves the religion, because it stops people from playing around with the religion. Using one ayah, which has nothing to do with the topic, and they said, oh yeah, this is the ruling because of this ayah. When you use usul al-fiqh, and you have to be really precise that, okay, this ayah doesn't actually apply to this ruling, then you realize, and that's how you preserve the rulings. And number 4 is making ijtihad and doing taqleed, like I mentioned. We talk about the mujtahid, the alim, and the one asking the questions, and all the rulings pertaining to that. Okay, so with that, inshallah, that should give you a better understanding of what usul al-fiqh is. We've mentioned the definition, and we talked about some of the general. We've given many examples of some of the things which are studied in usul al-fiqh. Now we are going to move on to the benefits of studying usul al-fiqh. Now the benefits are many. And I actually had written over about 20 benefits. I think I've summarized it. I only mentioned 14. And I knew it would take a long time to mention all of them, so I've written them now out for you as well, just to make it easier. Like I said, we have a lot to take, so to make it easier, inshallah. Now, Tanveer's gone. Right, I was using Tanveer's internet. Tanveer, he's gone. Sorry, 1 second. Technical difficulties. Right. We're back, alhamdulillah. No, I've turned the volume off now. Right. You won't hear that today. Okay. We're going to move on to some of the benefits of studying usul al-fiqh. And this shows you the importance of the science. And even though it's so important, it's something which is neglected a lot by many students. Okay, and that's why you find maybe some of the students are not as strong in their knowledge, because of their lack of understanding of usul al-fiqh. So we're going to take, inshallah, even in hadith you need usul al-fiqh, because once you have a hadith, you want to benefit from the hadith and you want to get a ruling, you use usul al-fiqh. That's why if you look at the books of the explanations, Ibn Hajar, Fath al-Bari, Imam Nawawi's Sahih Muslim, for example, they're full of principles of usul al-fiqh. The tafsir by Shaykh al-Amin al-Shaqiti, it's amazing tafsir, full of, because he used to teach usul al-fiqh in Medina University as well. It's full of usul al-fiqh principles. So usul al-fiqh is something very important. And that's why the first benefit is the main and the most important benefit of usul al-fiqh, which is it allows us to understand the goal. Meaning, it allows us to understand the meaning of the Quran and Sunnah. It allows us to understand the Quran and Sunnah. The statement of Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, verily the objective or the goal of usul al-fiqh is that you can understand the intent of Allah and His Messenger in the Quran and Sunnah. So this, you get an ayah. What does the ayah mean? How do we come to the conclusion? We have the ayah, we have the conclusion. In between, what's that process? That's usul al-fiqh. That process in between, that is usul al-fiqh. And obviously, as we go through the examples, it'll make a lot more sense, inshallah. Number 2, having the ability to understand the Quran and Sunnah upon the understanding of the Salaf. Meaning, if a person was to just try to, derive rulings himself, then he will come to conclusions which the Salaf never came to. But if you use usul al-fiqh, then that's why some of the ulama, some ulama have defined, when you say we study the Quran and Sunnah upon the understanding of the Salaf, this is usul al-fiqh. Because Salaf, they use usul al-fiqh. Okay?
Intent of Allah.
So if Allah has mentioned an ayah, what does Allah mean by this ayah? What's the ruling we extract from this ayah? That's what He means. The Arabic word used was murad, so which means intent. But what He basically means is that if Allah says aqimus salah, establish the prayer, what's the meaning? The meaning is salah is obligatory. That's what I mean by the word intent. Number 3, knowing the principles are applicable for every time and place, because the Sharia is sound and perfect for every time and place. This is something to be proud of, as no other religion has this. So when you learn usul al-fiqh, you realize and you learn how to apply the Quran and Sunnah in every time and place. Okay, without usul al-fiqh you can't do that. When you just have the hadith, just that, maybe the Prophet is talking about something which is specific at that time. So if he's talking about camels and, but he's talking about traveling on camels. We don't travel on camels. I don't know, Sheikh, I don't know, do Kuwaitis still use camels? No? But most of us use cars, yeah? So we say, oh no, that's specific to a camel. We can't use the rulings, we can't apply it to cars. You use usul al-fiqh, especially when it comes to qiyas and so on, and you examine those ahadith, and then you extract the rulings, and through usul al-fiqh, you can apply it to modern day. Okay, so through usul al-fiqh, you know that all these principles and rulings can be applied in any time and place. The 4th is that it preserves the Quran and Sunnah, the Sharia. We talked about, it stops people from playing around with the religion. That's why many a time when people have these new, they want to come with these new rulings and new ideas in Islam, majority of the time it's only the general people that get confused with these things. The scholars, because they know usul al-fiqh, they know easily how to refute these new type of claims. So usul al-fiqh, it preserves the Quran and Sunnah. Number 5, we can come to know the secrets and wisdoms of the Sharia and what the Sharia is preserving. So you can know the wisdom behind something. They use usul al-fiqh for this, especially when it comes to science of qiyas. They talk about the illah and so on. You can understand that why has Allah legislated this. You can use usul al-fiqh. Not always. Obviously, there are some things which are only specific, only Allah knows, we don't know. But there are some things where a person can maybe understand the reason for that. Like alcohol. Why is alcohol haram? Because it intoxicates. Okay? And that intoxication leads people to do evil actions and so on. So we've taken that in usul al-fiqh. It clarifies the way of doing ijtihad for the one who wants to be a mujtahid. So if somebody wants to become a mujtahid, so he's able to extract rulings himself, then he has to go through usul al-fiqh. Number 7, there is a systematic method of extracting rulings and providing fatwa, and you learn the principles of giving verdicts of fatwa and how these are given. So this is, the last part of the book, the 4th part of the book that we talked about. Now, if somebody wants to give a fatwa, it's not simple as, okay, I've studied this in a fiqh book, somebody asks me a question, I can give him a fatwa. No. There's more. You have to look at the situation, you have to look at so many different things. And it's through usul al-fiqh that, and also maybe maqasid shar'iyya, which is a branch of usul al-fiqh, that can a person, and also qawaid fiqhiyya, which is also similar to usul al-fiqh as well, can a person give different fatwa. Number 8, contentment and increase in iman. That when you study these things, it actually increases you in iman, that how the religion is actually preserved, and how much the ulama, and especially the salaf, how much effort they went through to preserve the religion. Number 9, humility. You realize you know nothing. Develop hesitancy to speak of the imams of the past aimlessly. Basically, you realize how much you don't know. When you study usul fiqh is very precise, and it can get quite technical. So the more you learn, you actually realize that you don't really know anything. And then it also shows the high status of the ulama of the past. And there are some people who turn around and say that which is somewhat is correct, but they use it in a wrong way. So they would say along the lines of maybe some of these imams, they were just men. They were just men. They can make mistakes, and we're men as well. We can make mistakes. We can say correct things as well. But there's a big difference. You are not men like the way they were men. Okay? And their knowledge is not the knowledge that you have. So when you study Usool al-Fiqh, you realize how precise and how technical their knowledge was. So it prevents a person from speaking about them like they were just normal people. Like, yeah, that's his opinion, but I disagree. No, who are you to disagree? You don't. Like when you study Usool al-Fiqh, you realize that there's a whole process, there's a lot of details, it's very technical. I guess sometimes, especially in the bigger books, it can get very confusing. And all of that is studied in Usool al-Fiqh. Number 10, it increases one's confidence of the ijtihad of the scholars they follow. So when you study Usool al-Fiqh, you understand that why this alim got to this conclusion. Number 11, which leads on to number 11, one will learn what makes scholars differ and why there is khilaf among some issues. So when ulama differ, okay, many a times because of Usool al-Fiqh, and we studied a book in Medina called Bidayat al-Mujtahid, which is comparative fiqh. So fiqh of a certain issue, the opinions of all of the imams. And we will learn, okay, sometimes it's one hadith. Every scholar is using the same hadith, but it's their understanding and the way they look at the hadith which differs. And that's why they have different opinions. So then you will look at Usool al-Fiqh, you will look at the principle of Usool al-Fiqh, you will say, okay, he said this because he used this principle of Usool al-Fiqh. And he said this because he used this principle of Usool al-Fiqh, and so on. Okay? Majority of the time, yeah, correct. Sometimes, just because somebody differed doesn't always mean 100% correct. But especially when you talk about the Imams of the Salaf and so on, then yeah. There's a chapter in here, we will take at-ta'arud. When there's like a hadith are differing, what do you do? We're going to take some of these, inshallah. So some of these examples will make it a bit more clear, inshallah. And sometimes you can realize, okay, why they differed, then which approach which is better, which is stronger. That's another issue that comes after this. But at least initially you can understand why they differed. And then which approach is better, that's a different issue. Number 12, by studying Usool al-Fiqh, you can call people to following the evidence wherever it is. So it stops people blind following. If you know Usool al-Fiqh, then it allows you to look yourself and understand yourself why the scholars got to there. It doesn't necessarily mean that, let's you study a bit of Usool al-Fiqh. It doesn't mean that you can give your own rulings now, and you can give your own fatwa, okay, especially if you're still a student. But it at least allows you to understand, and you have more appreciation for it. And then if you get to a very high level, then maybe you can. Number 13, on the other hand, your aqeedah can be tampered with if you do not study books with a teacher. On the flip side, once you have studied with a teacher, Usool al-Fiqh can be means of protecting your aqeedah. What this basically means is that you can use Usool al-Fiqh even in the science of aqeedah. So it can be used to protect your aqeedah. So because it's similar to fiqh in the general sense that you have an ayah and you extract the ruling using Usool al-Fiqh to get your fiqhi ruling. Likewise, those are hadith talking about your aqeedah. Usool al-Fiqh is used and you can prove your aqeedah. So it's also a means of protecting your aqeedah. And number 14, the fiqhi rulings are protected. And that's because we are talking about Usool al-Fiqh. The word fiqh is there. So the main thing is fiqh. Okay, the lineage. Some of these points are a bit quicker, so I'm going to go through them quick, inshallah. The lineage, what is the lineage of Usool al-Fiqh? It is a science from the Islamic. So what this means is that how is it linked? How is it linked to the other sciences? Okay, how is it linked to the other sciences? It is linked from the other sciences, and there is so much overlap and intertwining between them. And to be honest, this point is general for all of the Islamic sciences. This point is actually general for all of the Islamic sciences, and you'll find that all of them overlap. So if you use Usool al-Fiqh, you cannot be a faqih, okay, if you a true faqih of the highest caliber, if you don't know Usool al-Fiqh. If you don't know Usool al-Fiqh, then you can't. Then you're either following somebody else, you're doing taqlid of somebody else, because you are not able to extract rulings yourself. So Usool al-Fiqh is linked to other sciences because it takes from them. For example, Arabic, Aqidah, Qira'at, Mustalah Hadith, and so on. So Arabic is used a lot because the Quran and Sunnah are revealed in Arabic. So what does this Arabic word mean? If alif or lam is added to a word, does that show it's general? Does it mean specific? If it's fi'l amr, which is a commandment, what does that show? So it's to do with Arabic. And your aqidah as well. Aqidah, I mentioned aqidah because you will find some Ahlul Bid'ah, their usul principles are different because of their aqidah. Their aqidah affected the usul al-fiqh principles. Qira'at, so for example, we have qira'at mutawatira, shadha, are they a dalil, are they not, and so on. Mustalah al-hadith, so especially, remember we said, usul al-fiqh looks at it from a bird's eye view. So it's going to look at the sunnah from a bird's eye view. Hadith, for example, can hadith abrogate the Quran? Because obviously Quran is stronger, it's higher level, the speech of Allah compared to the speech of Prophet. So can hadith abrogate the Quran? Okay, or can it not? That's something which is discussed in usul al-fiqh. So what happens, especially when you talk about the sunnah, it does overlap with mustalah al-hadith quite a lot. But there are some differences. So the way the scholars of usul al-fiqh look at mustalah, their opinions might be slightly different compared to how the muhaddithun look at hadith and so on. Can one study all of the other sciences and by this reach a destination in studying usul al-fiqh? So for example, let's say we say, usul al-fiqh contains Arabic, aqidah, qira'at, mustalah hadith. If I study Arabic and I become a master in Arabic, and in aqidah, and in qira'at, and mustalah hadith, does that suffice me and I don't have to study usul al-fiqh? The answer is no for two main reasons. The first reason is that there are many chapters in usul al-fiqh which can't be found in the other sciences. The first is that there are many chapters in usul al-fiqh which can't be found in the other sciences. So for example, qiyas, ijma', that's only in usul al-fiqh, that's not in mustalah, it's not in Arabic, and so on. And the second point is, even within these sciences, usul al-fiqh has developed certain points which can't be found in those sciences. I'll give you an example in a second. So even within those sciences, usul al-fiqh has developed certain principles and points which are not found in those sciences themselves. So I'll give you an example, and it'll be the same example as before, or linking to the example before. The example of an unrestricted commandment necessitates obligation. Yeah? The Arabic language will only tell you this is a fi'l amr, this is a commandment. So it'll tell you it's a commandment. That this type of word, when it's written like this, it's a commandment. But that's it. Arabic language does not tell you that shows that it's obligatory. That's what usul al-fiqh comes in. So even something to do with Arabic, usul al-fiqh has come and it has added and benefited, or added more and developed certain points in these sciences. The virtues of studying the science of usul al-fiqh, the next page. Okay. This is quite straightforward. When you talk about fada'il, the virtues of something, I'll just mention two general points. The first is that it is an Islamic science. It is an Islamic science. So all of the virtues for Islamic sciences can be applied for usul al-fiqh. So for example, the hadith, man salaka tariqan, whoever treads upon a path of seeking knowledge, Allah will make his path of Jannah easy for him. Usul al-fiqh is one of those sciences. And likewise, all of the other hadith and ayat which refer to Islamic knowledge. The second virtue is that it allows you to understand the Quran and Sunnah. It allows you to understand the Quran and Sunnah. And here I want to mention a benefit, which I've not added in the worksheet, but you can add, inshallah, is that the Islamic sciences are two types. Islamic sciences are two types. The first are known as ulum al-ghayah. Those sciences which are the objectives. So the objectives, or the goal. And the second is ulumul ala, those sciences which are instruments or pathways to allow you to reach the goal. Okay. So for example, from those sciences which are objectives, the Quran and Sunnah, Tafsir, these are objective. These are things that you need to know. You need to know how to pray. Your Aqidah, you need to know your Aqidah. So these are the goals and the objectives. And then we have other sciences such as Arabic language, Usool al-Fiqh, that these aren't the objectives, but these are sciences that you study to help you understand the objectives. Okay? So Arabic itself, by itself is not something which, is an objective. But the reason it's so important is because it helps you understand the Quran and Sunnah. Likewise, Usul al-Fiqh. It's like an instrument which helps you, or it's a key that allows you to understand the other sciences. So like tafsir, hadith, explanation of hadith, aqidah, fiqh. Aqidah, fiqh, and then you have instruments, usul al-fiqh, Arabic language, usul al-tafsir, mustalah al-hadith, okay, mustalah al-hadith. So we don't study mustalah al-hadith because, we need to know the definition of sahih and so on. La, we study this so that we can understand hadith. So that we can decipher which one is authentic, which one isn't, and which ones do we need to act upon and which ones we don't. So it helps us understand the hadith.
So when we're saying the science which are
Objectives of the goals.
Objectives of the goal. But the goal itself is to understand the Quran and Sunnah.
That's the objective. Simple terms, to understand the Quran and Sunnah. Same with tajweed. Okay? So with tajweed, why do we learn the rulings? That the letters of idgham are 6 and the 2 types with ghunna, without ghunna, so that you can apply it, So if a person actually will go directly to a teacher and he learns like this without studying the rules, that's fine. Because he's reached the objective. He's reached the goal. Okay? So in tajweed, that's fine. The asl when it comes to tajweed and Quran is that you read to a teacher. When it comes to the other sciences, fiqh and so on, then it's a bit harder to just jump straight to, especially higher level. So you need to know the ulum al-ghaya, you need to know Arabic, usul al-fiqh and so on. Okay, the next issue is the founder of usul al-fiqh. And this is the word in the poem, al-wadi'. Al-wadi'. So what we take in the poem, let's go back to the poem. Let's go back to the first page on the poem. Okay. Okay. So inna mabadi'a kulli fana 'ashara. The principles or the introductory points of each science are 10. Al-haddu, the boundary, i.e. the definition. We've taken the definition. Wal-mawdu'u, the subject. What are the topics which are studied? We've taken that. Thumma al-thamara, what are the fruits, the benefits? We've taken that. Wa nisbatun, its lineage, how is it linked? We've taken that. Wa fadluhu, its virtues. We've taken that. We've taken 5 things. Wal-wadi', its placer or founder. That's the one that we are on. That's the 6th one. That's the one that we are on. So if we go back now to the which page is it? No. Now the first one who actually wrote a book in Usul al-Fiqh, okay, is, I mentioned this other day. Who remembers? I mentioned the answer to this. It came in the hadith though, right? Who was the first one to write a book in Usul al-Fiqh? Imam al-Shafi'i. What was the name of his book? Al-Risala. Good. So the first one to write a book is Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. Anyone know when he passed away? I'll give you a clue. He was born 150. He was born in 150. No. Another clue. He was 54 when he passed away. 204. Khalas. Yeah, 204. He passed away in the year 204. Which year did Imam Abu Hanifa pass away? 150. So he was born in the same year that Imam Abu Hanifa passed away. Okay. Why did Imam Shafi'i write his book? We're going to mention a number of reasons for that. Why did Imam Shafi'i write this book? Al-Risala. A number of reasons. Reason number one is that Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, he requested from Imam al-Shafi'i to write a book that contains, and now he mentioned a number of different examples of different topics in Usool al-Fiqh, which has the acceptance of Khabar Ahad, regarding Ijma', regarding Naskh, abrogation, and so on. So basically, if you don't know all those examples, he basically requested him to write a book in Usool al-Fiqh, in simple terms. So all of these different words that he used, basically Usool al-Fiqh. So his student, Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi, he requested Imam Shafi'i to write a book in Usool al-Fiqh. And in the beginning, Imam Shafi'i was a bit doubtful. He didn't want, he was thinking about it. But then Ali ibn al-Madini, a great scholar of hadith, Ali ibn al-Madini, he encouraged him. So then he wrote the book. The second reason is to preserve the religion, because there were many non-Arabs, and also Ahl al-Bid'ah, so many non-Arabs entering into the religion, and also Ahl al-Bid'ah who are interpreting the Quran according to their own desires. Non-Arabs, so they didn't have language, they didn't have knowledge of the Arabic language, so they're making mistakes. I'll give you a couple of examples in a second, inshallah. And also Allah Ahl al-Bid'ah, that they were taking ayat and then they were interpreting those ayat in the wrong manner. So Imam Shafi'i used Usool al-Fiqh to refute them. And I'll give an example of the Arabic language, okay? And I'll mention two incidents of how not knowing the Arabic language changed the meaning, which has taken place. The first is, and this is one opinion of why the first book in Arabic grammar was written. There was Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, who was a tabi'i. Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, who was a tabi'i. He basically heard, or during his time, Ali radiallahu anhu, he was a Khalifa, okay? And there was a man who recited the ayah, وَأَذَانٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ إِلَى النَّاسِ يَوْمَ الْحَجِّ الْأَكْبَرِ أَنَّ اللَّهَ بَرِيءٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ وَرَسُولُهُ. This ayah, this part, أَنَّ اللَّهَ بَرِيءٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ وَرَسُولُهُ, which means Allah and His Messenger are free from the mushrikun. But a man, he recited it, أَنَّ اللَّهَ بَرِيءٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ وَرَسُولِهِ, instead of رَسُولُهُ. And Rasulih basically changes the meaning to Allah is free from the mushrikun and the Prophet, which obviously is a false meaning. It's Allah and His Messenger are free from the mushrikun. But because he didn't know Arabic and he didn't realize, that changed the meaning totally. So then it is said that Ali radiallahu anhu, he commanded Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali to write a book in Arabic grammar. Du'ali. The ayah is the beginning of Surah Tawbah, maybe ayah 4 maybe. Another story is regarding Abu Amr al-Basri. One time a Mu'tazili came to him, and the Mu'tazili, when it comes to Iman, they believe that anyone who commits a major sin is in the hellfire. In simple terms, they believe anyone A major sin. In this dunya, he's between two levels. He's not a Muslim, but he's not a kafir. But in the akhirah, he's in the hellfire. So basically, he's in hellfire. Anyone who commits any major sin. We say that the Ahl Sunnah say, shirk, if he dies major shirk without doing tawbah, then he's in the hellfire. As for the other major sins, he's under the will of Allah. But the Mu'tazila, they say that anyone who commits any major sin, he's in the hellfire. Okay? So he came along, and he came to Abu Amr al-Basri, he said, I found an ayah in the Quran, which proves my madhab. So he said, he recited the ayah, وَلَنْ يُخْلِفَ اللَّهُ وَعْدَهُ, that Allah does not go against His promise. But the word wa'ad, he understood it to mean wa'id, which means Allah doesn't go against His punishment. Meaning if Allah, Allah mentions certain actions, if a person does this, the punishment is this. So his understanding was, because Allah said He'll punish, that means He'll definitely punish him, and this person's definitely in the hellfire. Okay? So Abu Amr al-Basri turned around and said, there's a difference between wa'ad and wa'id. Wa'ad is something praiseworthy, it is to keep your promise. And wa'id is a punishment. So he basically refuted him using usul al-fiqh and the Arabic language. Okay? So that's why learning the Arabic language is very, very important. Obviously, these type of differences you can't tell when a book is translated. No. Okay, so these are a couple of reasons why Imam al-Shafi'i wrote the book. And now I'm going to mention a couple of reasons why was Imam al-Shafi'i, why was he so qualified to write a book in usul al-fiqh? Why was he him? Why didn't somebody else do it? Why Imam al-Shafi'i? I'm going to mention a couple of 3 points, inshallah. The first is how much importance he gives to the Quran and Sunnah. Al-Muzani, he narrates that Imam al-Shafi'i said, Al-Muzani said that Imam al-Shafi'i said, I memorized the Quran when I was 7 years old. I memorized the Quran when I was 7 years old. And I memorized Al-Muwatta, Muwatta Imam Malik, when I was 10. Yeah. I memorized the Quran when I was 7, and I memorized the Muwatta Imam Malik when I was 10. And Al-Rabi' he said, that every time I entered upon Imam al-Shafi'i, he had the Quran was between his hands, and he was following the ayat pertaining to rulings. Meaning he was pondering over the Quran and he was looking at those ayat and how to extract rulings. So all of this shows that he had a very, very strong connection with the Quran and Sunnah, Imam al-Shafi'i. And there's also a story which you can just do an indication towards now, but I'll mention it tomorrow when we talk about ijma'. There's a story of how Imam al-Shafi'i, he proved that ijma' is a dalil. Okay? That Imam al-Shafi'i proved that ijma' is a dalil. We'll talk about that story tomorrow. Because of time, we won't mention it now. The second reason is because of how strong he was in the Arabic language. Imam al-Shafi'i was very, very strong when it came to the Arabic language. And for something to be considered, part of the Arabic language and so on, majority of the time they, apart from the Quran obviously, they used Arabic poetry and so on. That's why they extract a lot of the rulings from, because obviously the Arabs were, at the time of Prophet the highest level of Arabic. And they, the ulama allow it and they take it for the first century. They say in the time of the Sahaba and Tabi'een, the Arabic was very strong as well. And then many of the scholars of Lugha, they make an exception and they say, but Imam al-Shafi'i also enters into this because of how strong his language was. So Imam al-Shafi'i passed away when? 204, which is quite a long time later. Many of them give an exception for Imam al-Shafi'i and say, like, his Arabic was so high, we have to add him in as well. And the third point is that he was very intelligent and very sharp. Imam al-Shafi'i was very intelligent and very sharp. And I was going to mention a few stories, but because of time, we'll stop here, inshallah. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we will continue after the 5-minute break, inshallah. بإذن الله. طيب سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Shall we start? Yeah? Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Still under this topic of the founder of Usool al-Fiqh, we want to quickly talk about the history of how Usool al-Fiqh was until the time of Imam al-Shafi'i. As for after the time of Imam al-Shafi'i, we'll talk about that towards the end when we talk about the different madhahib. So, we can start off with the question, was Usool al-Fiqh present in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And the answer is yes. And this is the same answer that I gave to the other question, that did the Sahaba know Arabic grammar? What do we say? We said yes, they knew it because they spoke Arabic. So in terms of application, they knew it inside out better than all of us. But if you mean in terms of a science of how we study it now, and even maybe some of the points that we mentioned, like the way we are doing it now and the way it's written, then no, because obviously this was written later on after the Arabic language became weaker, non-Arabs were entering into Islam, knowledge became weaker and so on. So then the ulama had to explain it in an easy way. But in terms of the knowledge actually being there, then yes, it was there. And in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, just quick summary inshallah, the main evidences were what? The main evidences were the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ himself. So any issue, they would go back to the Prophet ﷺ. And a little bit of qiyas was there as well. Because there was a hadith of when the Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Yemen, the Prophet ﷺ said to him, with what will you rule the people? And he said, the book of Allah. And then what? And he said, the sunnah of his Prophet ﷺ. And then what? If you can't find it in the Quran and Sunnah, then he said, then I will do my own ijtihad. And I will try to work it out from the knowledge that I have, from the Quran and Sunnah that I have. So from this, the ulama extract that some sort of qiyas and ijtihad was there in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But that hadith has some, it's not the most authentic, and the ulama differ in its authenticity. But majority of the time, even if the Sahaba did do their own ijtihad, then if they were able to, they would go back to the Prophet ﷺ and confirm that what they did, was it correct or not. So majority of the times that would happen, but maybe sometimes here and there, like when Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Yemen, Mu'adh is in Yemen. There's no WhatsApp call or anything like that he can just call the Prophet ﷺ. So he couldn't reach the Prophet ﷺ, so maybe there were times that he had to do a little bit of ijtihad, but that was very, very little. Majority was the Quran and Sunnah. And there were times that even within a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ used qiyas himself. He person himself, when he gave an answer, he would use qiyas. So, for example, there's a hadith which is in Bukhari and Muslim. Ibn Abbas narrates that a woman came to the Prophet ﷺ. A woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and she said that I have made a vow to do Hajj. But she passed away before she could do Hajj. Should I do Hajj on her behalf? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, you should do Hajj on her behalf, because if your mother had a loan to pay off, wouldn't you pay off that loan? Yes. So likewise, this is like a loan belonging to Allah that you have to pay off. So the Prophet ﷺ said, فَاللَّهُ حَقُّ بِالْوَفَاءِ, Allah has more right for you to fulfill that obligation. So in the speech of the Prophet ﷺ, this type of qiyas could be seen. The Prophet ﷺ gave the example of a loan, and he applied it to Hajj. In the time of the Sahaba, it was a bit more, the same was still there. but now they had to use qiyas a lot more. Because now if a new issue arose, which Prophet didn't specifically talk about, or it's not specifically mentioned in the Quran, then they would have to use al-qiyas and so on. And then in the time also there was ijma'. There's something called ijma'. Ijma' started to show now, which was when if all of the Sahaba got together, then this is known as ijma' of the Sahaba. Ijma' of the Sahaba. So the tabi'in later on they would say that this is the ijma' of the Sahaba, for example. And also another proof was the statement, the sayings of the Sahaba. So if a tabi'i was to use a particular dalil, they would say this is the statement of this Ibn Umar or Abu Hurairah or whoever it may be. And like this, it slowly developed until the time of Imam Shafi'i. And then once Imam Shafi'i wrote a risala, after that many of the books were written, and we will talk about the different madhahib towards the end of this introduction, inshallah. On the next page, the names or the name of the science. It's called Usool al-Fiqh, and it's also known as Al-Usool. So, and that's something we would say a lot. So if my friend said to me, which lesson do you have now? I'll say, we have Usool. We would just say we have Usool. So when you say Usool, it's referring to Usool al-Fiqh. It's not referring to Usool al-Tafsir or something else. Usool by itself generally is referred to Usool al-Fiqh. This reminds me, that who remembers what's the title of the book that we will study? Al-Usool min ilm al-Usool. So Usool from the science of Al-Usool. Okay, the word Usool comes twice. I want one person, put your hand up inshallah. What does the first Usool mean and what does the second Usool mean? I said put your hand up, I'll pick someone. The first one is?
Usul mean the foundation.
Okay.
And the second school means the...
What's the second Usool mean? Ilm al-Usool.
That is the foundation.
Sorry?
That is the foundation.
Yeah. The foundation is the first one. Al-Usool, the first one is referring to foundations. Ilm al-Usool is referring to the science, the technical definition that we give. So the foundations in the science of Usool al-Fiqh. That's what was it translated to in English?
The foundation of the knowledge of Usool.
The foundation of the knowledge of Usool, Usool al-Fiqh. Okay? So now. And then Usool al-Sharia. This is also another name. Usool al-Sharia. The foundation of the principles of the Sharia, which is basically Usool al-Fiqh. Derivation, Usool al-Fiqh is derived from many different sciences. We kind of talked about this previously. It kind of overlaps with another point, so I'm just going to mention this quickly, that it overlaps with Aqidah and also the Arabic language and also fiqh as well. Fiqh is another one. Yeah. And some ulama also add ilm al-kalam, rhetoric. And they add this in because rhetoric is, ilm al-kalam is basically a number of principles which are not taken from the Quran and Sunnah, which Ahlul Bid'ah brought about themselves. Okay, and the reason it's mentioned this because in Usul al-Fiqh there are many scholars from Ahlul Bid'ah that actually wrote books in Usul al-Fiqh. So Usul al-Fiqh was heavily affected by Ahlul Bid'ah because they added a lot of these principles from ilm al-kalam, rhetoric, they added it into Usul al-Fiqh. And we're going to talk about some of the books and stuff later on, inshallah. The next one, the Islamic ruling of studying Usul al-Fiqh. The ruling of the one who wants to become a mujtahid and independently extract rulings, then Usul al-Fiqh for this person is fardu ayn, meaning it's an individual obligation, meaning a person cannot become a mujtahid if he doesn't know Usul al-Fiqh. So he fardu ayn, meaning he has to know Usul al-Fiqh. If you want to be a mujtahid, you have to know Usul al-Fiqh. Second, the ruling for everyone else. So what about the ruling for everyone else? Is it obligatory upon me to learn Usul al-Fiqh? This is known as fardu kifaya, a collective obligation, meaning if as long as some people or enough people from a certain community or from the ummah, they fulfill this obligation, then it falls off the shoulders of everybody else. And we'll talk about this slightly later on, inshallah, when we talk about the different types of fard and wajib. We're going to talk about fard ayn, fard kifaya, wajib, mudayyiq, muwassa', all of that, inshallah. The next question, what do we study first, fiqh or usul al-fiqh? And ulama differ in this, but what seems to be better is that when it comes to the basic obligatory actions of the religion, in fiqh, you study them first. Okay? So how to pray, you study that first. You don't need to go into all of usul al-fiqh. You need to know how to pray. Okay? And the reason the khilaf is because it's one of those that you use usul al-fiqh to understand fiqh. You use usul al-fiqh to understand fiqh. So that's what some ulama would say. You study usul al-fiqh first so that you can understand fiqh. But the reality is that especially those basic rulings, every Muslim can understand, even without usul al-fiqh. So how to pray, what to say, these basic things and other rulings which are obligatory for every person to know, you should study them first. And then when a person wants to go to a high level, then he studies usul al-fiqh. The prayer?
Yeah.
Okay, so for for example, let's say you are a new Muslim, you don't know how to pray. You don't know how to pray salah. There's 2 lessons going on, same time. One is usul al-fiqh, and the other is how to pray salah. Okay? Which one should this new Muslim go to? How to pray. Because that's obligatory one. He needs to do that 5 times every single day. Okay? As for usul al-fiqh, once he knows how to pray and also all of the other obligations, okay, then he can move on to usul al-fiqh, and then once he wants to study fiqh in more detail, then he can use usul al-fiqh. But as for the basics, a person shouldn't, because what the issue is that if a person starts going into usul al-fiqh and everything, then he doesn't know the basics, obligations, then he's going to be falling into haram, he's going to be missing out obligations, he's going to be sinful, and so on. Last question, can usul al-fiqh be taught in English? The reality is, especially in detail, no, it can't. Especially in detail, it can't. I'll give you a couple of examples of Arabic from before. However, maybe general understanding of some of the general principles can be explained in English, but to have a true, proper, full idea, it has to be studied in Arabic. And that's one reason why usul al-fiqh is not taught as much in English as it is in Arabic, because it's very hard to teach it in English. Many a time when I tell my teachers that I'm teaching usul al-fiqh, they ask, in English? Because it's very hard. I think Shaykh Uthman said that as well. When Shaykh Uthman al-Khamisi, he said the same thing. He said, in English, how are they finding it? They understanding? Because you have to have usul al-fiqh to understand it properly, has to be in the Arabic language. Because it's based upon the Arabic language. And we give a few examples of that. Okay, issues within usul al-fiqh. Now this, issues within usul al-fiqh is basically, you talk about what are the actual issues that we study in usul al-fiqh. And here I would have mentioned maybe some different type of issues, but what we'll do, just because of time, okay, because like I said, 2 days to finish the whole book is a bit less time. We'll just skip this for now, because the issues we're going to take in the whole book. Because alhamdulillah, in the next 2 days we are going to take all of the issues. So alhamdulillah, as you study, you can add them in yourselves later. Okay, so we'll just save time like that, inshallah. Okay, part 2. Right, the reason this is called, on the next page now, part 2, is part 1 is basically based upon the poetry. It was based upon that poetry. So if you go through the poetry, إن مبادئ كل فن العشرة الحد, the definition we've taken. والموضوع, the subject we've taken. الثمرة, the benefits we've taken. ونسبة is how it's linked with everything, the lineage we've taken. Its virtues we've taken. The founder we've taken. والاستمداد, how it's derived we've taken. The name we've taken. حكم الشرع, the ruling we've taken. And the issues we just skipped over that right now. So all of those points in the lines, those lines of poetry we've taken. And part 2, reason we call it part 2 is just basically some extra points which are not mentioned in that poetry. But that poetry is very important. There's some mistake in the Arabic in the ordering here. So we said it correctly, so make sure you correct it. But if you can memorize it, then that's very good, because it's used in usul fiqh, aqidah, fiqh, hadith, All of these points are points that you should know about each science. And if you know these points, then before you've even started studying the science, you have a good bird's eye view and a good understanding of what that science is. Okay, the madhahib and different authors or authorships in Usool al-Fiqh. Now, in Usool al-Fiqh, there are different ways and different madhahib in how to study Usool al-Fiqh. And there's a few. There's about 5 in total, to be honest. But we're going to mention 2 because these are the main 2. The first is called, and I've written it here, Tariqat means way, Tariqat al-Jumhur, or it's also known as Tariqat al-Shafi'iyya because Imam Shafi'i followed this way, and because he was the first one to write it, it's named after him. Or Tariqat al-Mutakallimin. Mutakallimin are those the scholars who delve into ilm al-kalam, and it's important to mention that when you say mutakallimin, it doesn't mean that every single person who follows this path is from mutakallimin. It's just that the majority of the scholars who wrote in that science, many of them are from the mutakallimin, so it just kind of got famous with that name. But like we said, Imam al-Shafi'i and many from Ahlul Sunnah, they follow this way. The second is known as Tariqat al-Hanafiyya or Tariqat al-Fuqaha. So this is basically the way that the Hanafi school of thought, they follow. So in simple terms, especially the Hanbalis, Malikis and Shafi'is, obviously they have slight differences, but the general way of looking at Usul al-Fiqh, they have one way, and the Hanafis have a different way of looking at Usul al-Fiqh. So, what are these ways? Let's take them both individually. First, number one is the first way, which is Tariqatu al-Mutakallimin. Okay? Which is the Hanabila, Shafi'i, and Malikiyya. Okay. What they do is that they extract and they affirm the usuli principles. They extract and affirm the usuli principles from the proofs and evidences. From the proofs and evidences. Without looking at the fiqhi rulings. Without looking at the fiqhi rulings. I'll explain what that means. Without looking at the fiqhi rulings. Okay? So what this means is that they will look at ayat and ahadith, and if they were from the actual mutakallimin, those that studied rhetoric, ilm al-kalam, they will look at their principles and so on. But meaning, look at the proofs, and then from these proofs and ayat, they will extract their usul al-fiqh principles. Meaning, for example, they will look at every time a commandment is in the Quran, the Sahaba, they always saw this to be an obligation, and they always acted upon it, and they never left it off, and so on. So that means that from these proofs we can gather that every time a commandment comes, which is unrestricted, it means that it's obligatory. So like that, they've come to the usul al-fiqh principle. Okay? So that's what this means. That's what this means. We'll speak a bit more about this madhab, and then we'll go to the second, because the second way is different in the way they do it. And why is it called Tariqatul Mutakallimin? I answered this. It's because many of the ulama who wrote in this method, they were from the scholars of kalam, which means rhetoric, many of them from Ahlul Bid'ah, but it's not a condition that everybody from who studies under this tariqah or this madhab is from Ahlul Bid'ah. It's just that many of them who actually wrote books in there were from ilm al-kalam.
We also say that, like hadith or something, like if you have faqih and scholars of hadith, like that.
Yeah, so many of the scholars of hadith, they would come under the first category. Like I said, it's mainly the Hanafis on one side and everybody else on the other side. There are a few other ways, but I've not mentioned them. But it's mainly these two. Okay? Okay. We'll move on to the second, which is Tariqatu al-Hanafiyyah. Okay. The difference is, what do? They look at the fiqhi rulings first. They look at the fiqhi rulings, and based upon the fiqhi rulings, they establish the usuli principles. So they will say that, look, in our madhab, or Imam Abu Hanifa, in this issue, this was his opinion. And they will say, okay, and the way he got to this opinion from the ayat and stuff, and from the hadith, is by using this principle. Therefore, that's the principle. So they will look at the fiqhi rulings, and basically from the fiqhi rulings, they will extract their principles. So they look at it from the opposite way.
They look at the fiqh rulings from, like,
Mainly what the Imam, what the madhab said, but mainly the Imam. And then they will say that the only way that the Imam got to this, or the madhab got to this ruling, is through this principle. Therefore, this is our principle in Usool al-Fiqh. So you see a difference. The first group, they look at the ayat and the hadith and the proofs, and they extract the rulings, and then afterwards, any issue comes, they apply that principle in whichever scenario it is. But the others, they look at what the Imams have said in terms of the fiqh rulings, and then they say that the only way he could have come to this was through, this is the principle, so therefore that's our principle. Okay?
Is it because they were far away from the geographic meaning? That's why?
That's another issue of why was it, generally, why did the Hanafi school of thought go more towards qiyas and less towards hadith, unlike the Ahl al-Hadith in Medina and so on. So that's the issue. That yes, because in Iraq and so on, hadith wasn't, especially at that time, wasn't spread as much as it was in Mecca and Medina, because that's where Islam started from. But it's not really the exact same as this. This is talking about later on in the madhab. And not at the time of Abu Hanifa, exactly. No.
Sorry. This came during the same century or something?
Sorry?
It came in same century, or this thing with the categories?
Are they in the same century? No, this is just, if you look at the madhab generally, how it developed, and look at their books, this is what you can find. So as the madhab developed, I want to say it's like the exact same year or something, but generally, as they developed in the 4th and 5th century, that's when it mainly took place. Okay? So before, Imam Shafi'i, there was no books in Usool al-Fiqh, but after that, once the madhahib were more established and then more books of Usool al-Fiqh started to be written, which is mostly in the 5th, 6th century, that's when this became more apparent. That's when this became more apparent.
The Shafi, Ahmadi and Maliki is one category and Hanafi is another category.
Yeah. Okay, next page. Suggested recommendations of book study for Usool al-Fiqh. These are just a couple, about 2-3 books that I mentioned. I mean, there's many other books as well. But just for you, if you wanted to study Usool al-Fiqh, what book should you study? So instead of me mentioning to you 100 different books, and you get confused, you don't know what to do, I'll just mention to you 3 books, okay? Now, it's best to do it in this order, but the first and second, they're very similar. So if you were to skip the first one, which like how we're doing it today, it's not the biggest issue. So the first book is called Al-Waraqat. And this is by, you got all the notes here, so there's not much that you have to write. By Imam al-Juwayni, okay? And his nickname was, or laqab was Imam al-Haramain. The Imam of the 2 Harams. And that's because he lived in Mecca and Medina, and he would teach in both places, so he got that name. Okay? He was actually an Ash'ari. Okay? So he wasn't from Ahlul Sunnah. In terms of fiqh, he followed the Shafi'i madhab. And he passed away in the 5th century, as you can see there. Now this book, Waraqat, is very, very small. Okay? It's not longer. Like compared to Usul Ilm Usul, it's very, very small. And generally the ulama, they advise memorizing this text as well. So Shaykh Qasim, he's got that Mutun Talib al-Ilm. In the 4th level is the first book that you memorize. Because of how small it is, and it's easy, and because the book was written, ulama generally give preference to those books that were written early on, compared to books that were written later on. So Ibn Uthaymeen just recent, right? they give preference to those written a long time ago. In terms of, somebody may turn around and say that he was Ash'ari. Why would we study his book? Which generally is the case. We don't study the books of Ahlul Bid'ah. However, they've looked at this book, and this is only the ulama don't say read his other books. Talking about this particular book, okay? Because it's so summarized and so small, okay? Each chapter is like about 10 words. Maybe it's very easy to memorize. And it took me like 3 weeks or something. It's very easy to memorize. It's not hard. So because of how small it is, there's no, not any clear or any dangerous opinions that go against a person's aqeedah. Okay? And if there are, then anyone, the scholar that's explaining, he would mention some certain points and so on. And because, like I said, he was from the earlier scholars, they give preference to that. And also because of how widespread this book is. Remember we talked about one of the factors ulama advise certain books over others is because of how widespread it is. So for example, Usool ibn Usool only has about 2-3 main explanations. Ibn Uthaymeen explained it himself in a very thick volume. There's this one that I've got here. And Sheikh Rumaithiya explained it recently, which just came out again in a very, very thick volume. And that's about it, to be honest. Al-Waraqat, you can find tens, if not 100 works on it. Okay? Because as it spreads, students memorize it, you find nearly every country you go to, somebody would be explaining this book. So that's why they mention this book, and it's a lot smaller than Usool min Ilm al-Usul. Okay, and there's a few explanations written there. The one that I would recommend is the second one. It says explanations of Waraqat. The second, Sharh Waraqat by Abdullah Fawzan. Not Shaykh Saleh Fawzan, Shaykh Abdullah Fawzan is somebody else. Okay, his explanation is very good. Shaykh Abdullah al-Fawzan. Sorry? Sharh al-Waraqat, explanation of Waraqat.
Scholar says to only if they want to study this book, but not the other books.
Not his other books. Not his other books, because the other books has philosophy and he has so many other things in it. The thing is, in Usool al-Fiqh, again it goes back to the issue of why is it called Tariqat al-Mutakallimin. The majority of scholars who did write in Usool al-Fiqh were from Mutakallimin. Mutakallimin, many of the Ahlul Bid'ah. So that's the issue we have. So somebody will say, okay, if that's the issue, then how do we study Usool al-Fiqh? And there's 2 ways of doing it. The first is that Ahlul Sunnah authored separate books to study, which they have done. Which the next 2 books are from Ahlul Sunnah. That's the first way. So you study their books. Or the second way is that you do study the books of Mutakallimin, but a Shaykh should explain anytime there's anything which is wrong, they explain that this is wrong. Okay, because the issue is the majority of the books go, even for example, the next 2 books are from Ahlul Sunnah, but when I talk about the third book is from Ahlul Sunnah, and we studied at Medina University, but the asl of that book was from Imam Ghazali's book. Okay, so Ibn Qudama, he came and he basically took out all the things that were wrong. So even they had to go back to those books. Okay, because the majority of the ulama, because when it came to Ahlul Bid'ah, they love all of this, Ilm al-Kalam, rhetoric and principles and this and that. So they ended up writing and they ended up adding a lot of their own, Ilm al-Kalam in there.
But would they also looking at the evidences as what he mentioned, look at the evidences and then
They would, in the general sense, that's why it comes under this. But they wouldn't do it in the correct way. Okay, so they would come with principles. When we say they look at the adillah, their adillah is not restricted to Quran and Sunnah. Their adillah extends to the aql. So any of these aqli principles that they had made in the science of ilm al-kalam, which we don't want to go into, but within there's many of the principles that they have made up themselves. So they would go back to them.
this book we don't find that.
In Waraqah, because of how small it is, it doesn't really go into any of them. Because of how small it is, it doesn't really go into them. And this is something we studied Mashanabwi, studied by many of the ulama explain it. Okay? So that's why I have mentioned it. The second is Al-Usul min Ilm al-Usul. Al-Usul min Ilm al-Usul. Now the Al-Usul min Ilm al-Usul is this book that we are studying. Okay, the book that we are studying. This, by the way, is an explanation of the book. The actual book itself is very small. You could buy it for, very cheap, inshallah. It's written by Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, who passed away just over 20 years ago. And the benefit of this book is that, firstly, the author has a correct aqidah. Okay, so the author has a correct aqidah, so you don't need to worry about the aqidah side of it. Okay. The second is that it's very, very easy to understand. Because he's more modern, and because he used to teach a lot, he knows how to teach. So it was very, very easy in the way he has written this book. Also, another benefit is that there are a lot of evidences and examples as well. So normally in Usool al-Fiqh, they don't mention any fiqh rulings because that's science of fiqh. But he would add fiqh rulings in as examples to allow you to understand Usool al-Fiqh better. So for example, if I just mentioned to you the principle, an unrestricted command necessitates obligation, and I moved on to the next issue, how much do you actually understand of that when you heard it the first time? But he would bring an example and he would apply it, and that would make a lot more sense. Okay? The next point is that each chapter is more complete, meaning he goes into a bit more detail, mentions a bit more information, and then more correct opinions than al-waraqat. Okay, so waraqat, because he was Shafi'i as well, and he leaned towards mutakallimin. Some opinions he maybe took the weaker opinion, not necessarily a big aqidah issue or anything, but Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, his opinions seem to be more stronger. Explanations of Usool min Usool. The first one is by Al-Ghazi Al-Utaybi, which is known as Taqrib al-Husul. This is the one that I have here. The one that I have here is Taqrib al-Husul. Another one is Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen did an explanation himself. There's a very thick explanation by Ibn Uthaymeen that he's written himself. And the third one that you can add, it just came out recently, by Shaykh Sulaiman al-Ruhaili. Shaykh Sulaiman al-Ruhaili is very thick as well. In one volume, he also explained Al-Usool min Ilm Usool. The last book we're mentioning here is Rawdatu al-Nazir. Rawdatu al-Nazir. And this is the one that we studied in the Islamic University of Medina and Faculty of Sharia over 4 years. It took us 4 years to study this book. It's written by Ibn Qudamah. You can see his name and everything there. After that, underneath the death, he passed away at 620. Summarize Al-Ghazali's Mustasfa, more upon the Hanbali madhab. So Imam Al-Ghazali had a book called Al-Mustasfa, and he was Ash'ari also. And maybe he went to philosophy a lot as well. And he was Shafi'i. So Ibn Qudamah came along, summarized it, took out all of the things that were wrong, took out the things relating to ilm al-kalam, rhetoric, and everything, and he based it more on the Hanbali madhab as well. So that's, one thing that the ulama of Sunnah should do is that these other books, you can say cleanse them if you want to purify them. You take out all the things which are wrong or are dangerous to a person's aqidah. And we mentioned a few explanations and a few summaries of Rawda, which if you get to the level of studying that book, then you can find all these other books that help you study this book. Now, if you go to the next page, which is the last page that we'll take, and alhamdulillah, with this we'll finish. And I've made this very easy for you. As you notice, I think today I've added a lot more writing than I do normally to make it. I don't think your hands are hurting as much today as normal. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I've added all of these names of different books in different mazahib. So the Hanafi madhab, I've written names here of names of books. The Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, the Zahiri madhab, and the Hanbali madhab also. I've added a number of books. And as you can see, the last book in the Hanbali madhab, Al-Usul min Ilm Usul, that's the one that we are studying. And with this, alhamdulillah, we have finished this introduction. I did summarize a lot of the points, but alhamdulillah, we have finished this introduction before Maghrib. And the reason I did summarize is because we have this whole book to go through. So I really do want to finish. I don't want to leave and we're in half the book or something. So we'll try to finish the book. We'll stop now. I know the Asr time is a bit long, so you can have a break now, inshallah. And straight after Maghrib, please try to come straight after Maghrib. Okay, we want to start as soon as we can. After Maghrib, we will start the book Al-Usul min ilm al-Usul. And those points that we have already taken, like the definition and one of the benefits, those things we can read quickly. Okay, and those things that we haven't, we can spend more time on that. Subhanakallah, alhamdulillah, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. الحمد لله انتهينا من المقدمة. ايه في 10 دقائق صح؟ لكن انتهينا من المقدمة فقلت نبدأ بالكتاب بعد المغرب.